Close your eyes and drift back to a quiet night in old Germany. In 1879, a baby is born beneath a blanket of stars. A child who would one day rewrite the very language of the cosmos. His name is Albert Einstein. As a boy who wasn't loud or quick or special in the ways the world expected, he stared at the light, the compass needle, the silence between seconds, and wondered why. He wasn't chasing fame, he was chasing truth. Tonight, as you rest your head, let us wander through his world, a world of questions and imagination, where curiosity bands the fabric of time itself. This is not just the story of a genius, it's the story of a dreamer who listened to the whispers of the universe. I'm Hypnos, and like every quiet night, I have a story to share. You may subscribe for the nights ahead. Tonight's tale is about Albert Einstein. This is not a lecture, nor a lesson. It's a quiet story, told slowly of a boy who seemed ordinary, even uncertain, but who grew to change how we see the universe. A tale of silence and patience, of music and questions, of a mind shaped not by quick answers, but by wonder. Let us begin where all great stories begin, in the soft light of childhood. The night was quiet in awe when a child opened his eyes for the first time. Outside, the river Danube moved slowly, carrying secrets from one town to another. Lanterns flickered in narrow streets. Shadows stretched across wooden doors. And the world remained unaware that in a modest house, a boy had entered life. A boy who would one day change how humanity imagined the universe. He did not arrive with trumpet or signs. He came silently, as most children do, and for many years he seemed ordinary, even doubtful in the eyes of others. His parents, Hermann and Pauline Einstein, welcomed him with both hope and worry. Einstein was slow to speak. Relatives whispered their concerns. Teachers would later frown at his hesitations, but silence shaped him. He listened, he noticed, his eyes followed dust floating in beams of light, shadows dancing across walls, the tremble of a candle flame. He spoke late, but he observed early. Not long after his birth, the family moved to Munich, where Hermann and his brother started a business in electrical equipment. The world was glowing with new possibilities. Wires stretched across streets, lamps replaced candles, dynamos hummed in factories. The Einstein home was modest, but it carried the hum of invention in the air. Pauline filled the house with music. She played the piano in the evenings, and Albert listened closely. Music spoke to him with clarity where words did not. Soon, he was given a violin. At first, he resisted practice, but the instrument became his friend. The bow under his hand, the sound vibrating against his chin, the notes filling the room. Music would become a lifelong companion, a place of comfort and expression. One day, when Albert was about 5 years old, he was ill and confined to bed. To distract him, his father handed him a small compass. The boy tilted it, turned it, shook it. The The needle trembled but always swung back north. Something unseen, something he could not touch, commanded that arrow. The mystery lit a spark within him. Later he would say it was one of his earliest memories of all, the first time he felt the pull of invisible laws shaping the world. School began, and with it came struggle. The classrooms of Munich were rigid. Teachers valued obedience and memorization. Albert was not quick to recite, not eager to follow others. He questioned rules. He hesitated before answering. He wanted to understand, not just repeat. Teachers grew impatient. Some called him lazy. One told him he would never succeed. Yet in mathematics, he found joy. Numbers spoke to him. Equations were puzzles that made sense. He was slow, but he was thorough, and he understood in ways that rote learning could not touch. At home, warmth and worry mixed. His father's business rose and fell, debt pressing on the family. Hermann bore it quietly, carrying the dignity of effort even in failure. Pauline steadied the home, playing her piano, feeding her children, bringing culture and music into their lives. Albert's younger sister, Maja, became his companion in play. Together they whispered secret, invented games, and softened the weight of their parents' concern. Albert's childhood was not filled with triumphs. It was filled with silence, questions, music, and wonder. He was not a prodigy dazzling the world. He was a boy who noticed. He asked, he wondered, he preferred quiet, walks to noisy games, books to chatter, the violin to drills. Teachers dismissed him, peers overlooked him, but within him seeds were forming. At night, he sometimes lay awake, listening to the city breathe, the bark of dogs, the rumble of carts, the faint voices through walls. He looked at the stars from his window and wondered what lay beyond. He imagined forces unseen, patterns hidden, truths waiting. Small questions in a child's heart began to grow. His discomfort with school deepened as he grew older. He resisted the rigidity of German education. Teachers saw him as insolent. He saw himself as curious in ways they did not value. His father's business failed, and the family moved to Italy, to Milan, seeking new opportunities. Albert remained behind for a time, finishing school in Munich with relatives, but loneliness pressed on him. Eventually he rejoined his family. Milan opened new doors, streets of art, music, and sculpture, markets alive with color, churches filled with sound. Albert wandered them, absorbing he read widely, philosophy, science, and literature. His questions grew larger, his mind stretched beyond classrooms into mysteries without easy answers. By adolescence, Albert was still not considered remarkable. He was hesitant, shy, uninterested in authority, but he carried with him silence, patience, and imagination. He remembered the compass, the violin, his father's honesty, his mother's music, his sister's companionship. These were not signs of genius that teachers could grade, but seeds waiting to bloom. The boy who walked Munich street with a slate in hand, who listened to the hum of his mother's piano, who wondered at the trembling needle of a compass, was quietly preparing for a life that no one around him could imagine. His childhood in Germany, shaped by music, silence, and curiosity, was coming to an end. Ahead lay Switzerland, new schools, new discoveries, and the beginnings of ideas that would one day change the stars themselves. The failures of his father's business pressed heavily on the Einstein household in Munich. Contracts were lost, debt rose, and Hermann carried the burden with quiet dignity. The family left Munich for Milan, chasing the hope of new opportunities. But Albert was left behind at first, living with relatives so that he could finish his schooling. The decision was practical, yet for a boy already restless under the weight of rigid classrooms, it was painful. Each day he sat at wooden desks while teachers barked orders. The chalk that stung his eyes, the endless recitations dulled his spirit. The boy who loved to wonder, who wanted to understand, found himself trapped in a system that demanded memorization without imagination. The tension between him and his teachers grew. Albert was not a troublemaker, not loud or disruptive, but he hesitated before answers. He resisted blind obedience, and he asked questions that unsettled the order of the class. Teachers saw his quiet defiance as insolence. One famously told him that he would never amount to anything. The words cut, but they did not shape him. Inside, Albert carried a stubborn sense that respect must be earned, not demanded, and that truth was greater than authority. The loneliness of being left behind pressed heavily on him. Letters from Milan spoke of family life, of new street and new neighbors, of his father's attempt to rebuild. He longed to be with them. Eventually, he left Munich and joined them in Italy, leaving behind a school system that had never understood him. The departure was not only from a city, it was from a way of thinking that had tried to box him in. Milan was different. Its streets were wider, its air lighter, its market filled with colors and smells. Albert walked among stalls of fruit and fabric, hearing languages mixed in the squares. He saw art and sculpture, buildings carved with history. He wandered through churches where music swelled into the rafters, through galleries where paintings seemed alive with light. Here, imagination was not punished but celebrated. For a boy whose heart leaned toward wonder, Milan was a kind of liberation. He read voraciously, philosophy, science, literature. He devoured books that stretched his mind in every direction. He began to see that knowledge was not a cage, but a door, and that questions were not defiance, but keys. He read Kant and Schopenhauer, books that spoke of the nature of reality and the limits of perception. He read scientific texts that sparked his fascination with the invisible forces that moved the world. He was no longer a child bound by rote lessons. He was a young man stretching beyond them. But his path still required formal education. He dreamed of studying at the Polytechnic in Zurich, a respected institution that promised deeper engagement with mathematics and science. He applied, but his first attempt failed. Though his marks in physics and mathematics were strong, he stumbled in other subjects. The rejection stung, but it did not end his journey. Instead, he enrolled at a school in Aarau, Switzerland, to complete his secondary studies. Aarau was unlike Munich. The classrooms were gentler, the teachers kinder, the methods freer. Here, students were encouraged to think, to discuss, to imagine. Albert thrived. He walked through the countryside, his mind drifting with the clouds. He carried notebooks filled with sketches of problems and thought. He lay in meadows and imagined himself riding in a beam of light, carried across space, asking what the world would look like if one could travel so fast. These were not assignments. They were daydreams, born of wonder and nurtured by freedom. The air of Switzerland suited him, its hills and valleys, its rivers and skies became companions to his thought. He was still shy, still quiet in large groups, but he opened in conversations with trusted friends. He preferred long talks with a single companion, where ideas could flow gently, rather than noisy gatherings. He played his violin in boarding houses, filling small rooms with music that softened his solitude. His notes carried warmth, and those who heard him saw not only a student, but a soul that reached through sound. The family with whom he boarded treated him with kindness, and he returned it with respect. He wasn't the loudest of their guests, not the most entertaining, but he was steady, thoughtful, and polite. They grew fond of him, and their home gave him stability he had long missed. The kindness of ordinary people steered his path in ways examinations never could. At Aarau, Albert discovered more than subject. He discovered himself. He realized that the strictness of Munich had not been a reflection of his worth, but of a system blind to wonder. In Switzerland, he felt that learning could breathe. He saw that curiosity was not rebellion, but life itself. He began to walk straighter, to feel that perhaps his questions were not flaws, but gifts. When he applied again to the Polytechnic in Zurich, he carried with him not only stronger marks, but stronger confidence. His mathematics and physics were excellent, his mind sharper for the freedom Aarau had given him. This time, the doors opened. He was accepted. The path to Zurich stretched ahead, promising study, discovery, and the companionship of minds as curious as his own. By now, he was no longer only the silent child, dismissed by teachers, nor only the boy who stared at a campus in wonder. He was a young man prepared to step into higher study, carrying with him music, memory, and imagination. The violin under his chin, the honesty of his father, the patience of his mother, the affection of his sister, and the independence discovered in Switzerland. These were his companions. The boy who had once been told he would fail had crossed into a land where failure no longer defined him. Switzerland had given him room to breathe, to question, to imagine, and soon Zurich would give him a place to turn imagination into study, and study into discovery. When Albert Einstein arrived in Zurich, the city greeted him with its mixture of calm and ambition. The streets were lined with trams rattling, steadily on their rails. The air carried the scent of bakeries and smoke from chimneys, and the river cut through the town with a steady silver flow. Around him, students hurried with books in hand, professors in long coats crossed courtyards, and the air buzzed with the quiet hum of learning. For Albert, it was a new world, freer than Munich, broader than Aarau, and full of possibilities. He entered the Polytechnic, officially the Swiss Federal Polytechnic School, where he would train as a teacher in physics and mathematics. The building itself was solid, with long halls echoing with footsteps, classrooms marked by blackboards covered in chalk, and laboratories filled with instruments that clicked, span, and shone with glass and brass. It wasn't only a place of study, but of conversation and debate. Students from across Europe gathered there, bringing different ideas, languages, and dreams. Albert, still shy in large groups, preferred quiet discussions. He was not one to dominate a room. He listened more than he spoke. But when he did speak, his words were deliberate, his thought careful. He made friends with a small circle of companions who would join him in long walks along the river banks, or sit with him in small cafes where the air smelled of coffee and tobacco, and ideas were traded as eagerly as coins. They called themselves by playful names, half in jest, but their conversations were serious, about science, philosophy, and the nature of the world. One of the most important friendships of his student years was with a fellow student, Mileva Mary. She was one of the few women studying physics at the time. Like Albert, she carried both intelligence and a sense of being different from those around her. They studied together, read books together, and shared questions that stretched far beyond the classroom. Their companionship deepened into affection. Albert admired her sharp mind, and Mileva respected his persistence and imagination. Their partnership would later become complicated. In these years, it was a source of inspiration and comfort. In lectures, Albert did not always shine in the ways professors expected. He disliked rigid instruction, preferring to learn on his own, from books, from thought, from long hours of reflection. He often skipped classes he found dull, choosing instead to sit alone and work through problems in his own way. Professors noticed his independence and sometimes frowned upon it. Some thought him careless, some thought him disrespectful, but Albert simply wanted to learn by understanding, not by repetition. He loved mathematics, but he loved physics more. Physics was, for him, a way of touching the invisible, a way of reaching the unseen forces that moved the compass needle, that carried light across space, that shaped the world in silence. He worked through equations late into the night, scribbling on scraps of paper, humming to himself, sometimes rising to play a few notes on his violin before returning to his work. Music and thought flowed together for him, as if one gave rhythm to the other. Zurich was not only study, it was also freedom. Albert walked the street with a sense of independence he had longed for. He visited bookshops where shelves overflowed with works of philosophy and science. He read Spinoza, whose calm words about God and nature stay with him throughout his life. He read texts on light, on electricity, on magnetism. Each book seemed to connect to the questions that had stirred in him since childhood. Sometimes he wandered beyond the city, into the hills and along the lakes. He walked slowly, thinking, watching the way light shimmered on water, the way clouds moved across sky. He imagined himself moving alongside a beam of light, racing with it, asking what the world would look like at such speed. This image, playful at first, would grow into one of the central questions of his later work. But in those moments, it was simply a daydream, carried on long walks. Examinations came, as they always do. Albert was nervous, but he passed. Not at the top of his class. His independence had cost him in the eyes of professors, but with enough strength to continue. His mathematics professors sometimes criticized him, saying he did not respect their methods. Yet in physics, he excelled, showing glimpses of the clarity that would one day change the world. He dreamed of an academic position after graduation, of working in a university, of devoting himself to study and teaching. The professors he had annoyed with his irregular attendance and his stubborn independence did not support him. When he graduated in 900, he found himself adrift, his plans uncertain. He had knowledge, he had imagination, but he lacked recommendation. In the meantime, he worked as a tutor, teaching students in small rooms, earning little, living modestly. He continued his studies on his own, reading papers, thinking through problems, writing notes. He was poor, often skipping meals, but he was not discouraged. He still carried within him the compass, the violin, the patience of Switzerland, the questions of childhood. These years in Zurich were not marked by glory or fame. They were marked by persistence, by independence, by friendships and music, by stubborn refusal to conform. They were the years in which Albert learned to trust his own way of learning, his own rhythm of thought. They were the years in which he realized that the world would not always reward curiosity quickly, but that curiosity itself was its own reward. And so when he left the Polytechnic, uncertain of his future, he carried with him more than a diploma. He carried the confidence that his question matters, or he carried the confidence that his questions mattered, that his mind, though different, had its own strength. He carried the companionship of Mileva, the memory of kind Swiss teachers, the independence found in Auro, and the freedom of Zurich's street. Ahead lay difficulty, ahead lay disappointment and rejection, but also ahead lay a modest office in Bern, where quietly he would write ideas that would shake the world. For now, though, he was simply Albert, a young man stepping out of Zurich, violin in hand, notebooks full of questions, ready to walk into whatever came next. After leaving Zurich, Albert carried his diploma with little certainty. The professors had irritated with his independent ways, did not recommend him for academic post. He dreamed of teaching, of a quiet desk in a university where he could live among books and equations, but doors did not open. Instead, he found himself wandering from one small job to another. tutoring students in cramped rooms, often earning barely enough to keep himself fed. The years after graduation were not kind. Yet, even in these struggles, he kept walking. He read constantly, filled notebooks with ideas, hummed as he played his violin to soften the weight of disappointment. He lived simply, sometimes skipping meals to save money, sometimes wearing clothes worn thin, but he never stopped thinking. Then, in 1902, a friend's father helped him secure a modest position at the Swiss Patent Office in Bern. The job was not glamorous. It was not the academy he had dreamed of. It was a clerk's position, examining patent applications for new inventions. Day after day, he read through descriptions of devices, electrical circuits, machines, gadgets, brass and wire. He was expected to judge if they were new, if they were useful, if they deserved recognition. The office was quiet. Rows of desks, the scratching of pens, the shuffle of papers. For Albert, it became a sanctuary. The steady work gave him stability, and the predictable hours left him evenings free. While others might have seen monotony, Albert saw freedom. The office became the stage upon which his imagination could wander unseen. During breaks, he walked the streets of Bern, his mind drifting into questions. What would it be like to ride alongside a beam of light? How did time itself behave if two people moved at different speeds? He carried these questions as one might carry smooth stones in a pocket, turning them over, feeling their weight, waiting for patterns to emerge. He formed a small group of friends, fellow thinkers, readers, companions of the mind. They jokingly call themselves the Olympia Academy. They met in cafes, over cups of coffee, in apartments where the lamps glowed late into the night. They read books of philosophy and science, argued gently, shared laughter, and encouraged one another's curiosity. These evenings fed Albert's spirit as much as his violin did. The patent office paid him modestly, but it gave him time. In that time, his imagination bloomed. In 1905, a year later known as his Annus Mirabilis, or Miracle Year, he published 4 papers that would change physics forever. One paper explained the photoelectric effect, showing how light itself could behave like particles, work that would later earn him the Nobel Prize. Another explained Brownian motion, the jittery dance of tiny particles in liquid, proving the existence of atoms beyond doubt. A third gave his first paper on special relativity, exploring the idea that time and space were not fixed, but relative to the motion of the observer. And the fourth, the simplest in form but deepest in consequence, gave the equation that would become famous across the world: energy and matter. He showed we're bound together, two faces of the same reality. But in 1905, Albert was not famous. He was a clerk in a patent office, a man in his 20s, living with his wife Mileva and their young children in a modest apartment, writing at a small desk late at night after the day's work was done. His neighbors saw him as ordinary. His colleagues saw him as diligent but unremarkable. Only those close to him sensed the depth of his thought. At home life was not always easy. Marriage to Maliva carried joys, but also strains. They had moments of warmth, of music played together, of walks shared, but they also quarreled. Money was tight, responsibilities pressed. Albert, though devoted to thought, sometimes struggled to balance the demands of work, family, and his inner world of questions. Yet through it all, his curiosity never dimmed. Each day at the patent office, he read inventions. Each evening, he returned to his notebooks. He walked the streets of Bern, watching trams and shadows, hearing bells mark the hour, imagining time itself stretching and bending with motion. While the world around him moved in ordinary rhythm, Albert's mind moved in extraordinary directions. Recognition came slowly. At first, his papers were read only by a few, discussed in small circles, but whispers grew. Professors who once dismissed him began to notice. The young man in Bern, patent clerk, had written ideas too clear to be ignored. Invitations arrived. Offers followed. The quiet years of frustration and persistence had blossomed into the beginning of a career. Albert, however, remained himself. He still preferred simple clothes. He still let his hair grow wild. He still walked with a violin case under his arm. He did not seek fame, though it began to seek him. He valued clarity, not applause. He valued questions, not reputation. Patent office years had given him more than a job. They had given him space to think, discipline to focus, freedom to follow wonder. They had shown that genius does not always live in great halls or gilded offices. Sometimes it lives in modest rooms, behind stacks of paper, in the heart of a man who refuses to stop asking. And so, when Albert left patent office, he carried more than his papers. He carried the proof even ordinary settings can give rise to extraordinary thought. The boy who once stared at a compass needle in wonder, the youth who clashed with stern teachers, the student who walked Swiss meadows imagining beams of light. That boy had grown into a man whose questions were beginning to reshape the universe itself. The quiet patent clerk of Bern had begun to stir whispers in the world of science. At first, his 1905 papers were read only by a small circle of physicists, but slowly recognition spread. Professors who had once dismissed him now leaned in, realizing that these papers, written by an unknown man outside the walls of academia, were not ordinary. They carried clarity and daring. They were the voice of someone who saw the world with fresh eyes. Opportunities began to open. He left patent office and accepted positions at universities. First, small lectureships, then professorships. He moved through Zurich, Prague, Berlin, each city adding a chapter to his career. Students filled classrooms to hear him, though his lectures were not always polished. He spoke softly, sometimes losing himself in thought, sometimes turning to the blackboard with chalk, spatching his hands, yet his ideas carried the room. He gave not just answers, but new ways of asking questions. In 1915, after years of work and struggle, he completed his general theory of relativity. Special relativity had explained how time and space were linked to motion, but general relativity went further. It proposed that gravity itself was not a force pulling objects together, but the bending of space and time around mass. The idea was radical, yet elegant. The universe, he showed, was not a rigid stage upon which matter moved, but a flexible fabric shaped by matter itself. Stars spanned the space around them. Planets curved the path of light, and the cosmos was alive with unseen geometry. The theory was brilliant. It was also fragile without proof. For years, physicists argued, some skeptical, some curious. Einstein himself waited, patient but uncertain. Then in 1919, an eclipse came. Expeditions set out to measure whether starlight bent as it passed near the sun, just as Einstein had predicted. When the result came back, the world changed overnight. Newspapers across the globe carried his name. Headlines proclaimed that a new theory of the universe had been proven, that Newton himself had been surpassed. The quiet patent clerk was now a celebrity. Fame arrived with a rush. Crowds gathered at his lectures. Photographers followed him. His face appeared in papers, his name on every tongue. In London, in New York, in Tokyo, people who had never read a page of physics spoke of Einstein. His wild hair, his thoughtful gaze, his calm presence became symbols of genius. He was invited to conferences, honored with rewards and awards, praised as one of the greatest minds of his age. In 1921, he received the Nobel Prize, not for relativity, still controversial in some circles, but for his explanation of the photoelectric effect. The prize brought prestige, yet Einstein remained himself. He wore the same simple clothes, let his hair grow unruly, walked with fueling case in hand. He lacked the attention, sometimes amused, sometimes weary. Fame, he said, was a mask others placed upon him, but beneath it, he remained Albert, a man with questions. He traveled widely, he sailed across oceans, lectured in halls packed with thousands, met leaders and scholars, kings and students. In Japan, crowds greeted him with reverence. In America, he was welcomed as a symbol of intellect and progress. In Europe, he stood at the heart of debate on science and philosophy. Everywhere he went, people sought his words, not only about physics, but about life, peace, and humanity. Yet, fame did not change his habit. He still lost himself in thought while walking. He still scribbled equations on scraps of papers, stuffed into a pocket. He still paused mid-conversation to follow an idea drifting through his mind. And always he returned to his violin, drawing sound from strings as naturally as thought from silence. Music remained his refuge, the place where his spirit found balance. Not all was joy. Fame carried burdens. His theories were praised, but also attacked. Some scientists resisted his ideas. Some mocked him. In Germany, where politics darkened with rising nationalism, his Jewish heritage made him a target. He faced hatred as well as admiration. He spoke openly for peace, for understanding between nations, for the dangers of rising intolerance. His voice was calm, but it carried weight, and it made him both admired and opposed. Through it all, He remained steady. He saw himself as a seeker, not a prophet. He laughed at honors, declined riches, and lived simply. His fame did not feed his vanity. It deepened his humility. He knew that the universe was vast, that his discoveries were only glimpses, that questions remained greater than answers. By the late 1920s, Einstein stood as one of the most famous figures in the world. His theories reshaped physics. His name symbolized genius. His image traveled everywhere. But beneath the fame was still the same man who had stared at the compass needle in wonder, who had walked Swiss meadows imagining beams of light, who had scribbled ideas late into the night in a patent office. He wasn't a man who sought greatness. He was a man who sought truth. As the 1930s approached, the world darkened. Politics in Germany grew violent. Hatred sharpened into laws and threat. Einstein, outspoken for peace and marked by heritage, became a target. The boy from Ulm, who had once been dismissed by teachers, was now seen by tyrants as an enemy. And so, as storms gathered over Europe, Einstein prepared once again to move, carrying with him not only his theories, but his violin, his notebooks, and his unyielding spirit of curiosity. The world Albert Einstein returned to in the 1930s was no longer safe for him. In Germany, hatred had risen into power, and his Jewish heritage made him a target. The same nation where he had studied, where he had lectured and dreamed, now turned dark with intolerance. His home in Berlin was raided, his books burned by those who despised both science and freedom. Einstein understood that he could not stay, and so, carrying his violin, his notebooks, and the unbroken spirit of a seeker, he left Europe. He sailed to America, welcomed by institutions eager to give him a place of peace. Princeton, in New Jersey, became his home. There, at the Institute for Advanced Study, he found the quiet he needed. The halls were filled with scholars, the town itself calm. His office was plain, a desk often covered in scraps of paper, chalk dust clinging to his sleeves, books stacked in corners. He did not seek grandeur, he sought space for thought. Einstein's daily life in Princeton was simple. He lived in a modest house with creaking floors and plain furniture. He walked to his office each day, notes stuffed into his pocket, often lost in thought along the way. Neighbors would greet him. Sometimes he returned the greeting. Sometimes he nodded absently, already chasing an equation in his mind. His hair, now wilder than ever, grew into a halo of white. He wore clothes that were comfortable, often mismatched, sometimes without socks. Fashion held no place in his life. Simplicity was his chosen garment. He still played his violin, filling his home with music, sometimes alone, sometimes with friends. Music had never left him. When the world grew heavy, the strings gave him balance. When words failed, the notes carried him. His violin was as much a companion as any colleague. In Princeton, he continued his work. He was no longer the young man of the patent office, bursting with discoveries that would reshape physics overnight. He was now a mature thinker, carrying decades of knowledge, Still restless with questions, he sought a unified field theory, a way of bringing together the forces of nature into a single, elegant picture. He worked at it tirelessly, scribbling equations, crossing them out, beginning again. He never found the complete answer, but he never stopped looking. For him, the search itself was as noble as the discovery. Beyond science, he spoke often of peace. He had fled a world torn by violence, and he saw the dangers of hatred and weapons. When the atomic bomb was developed, partly through letters he had signed warning of German ambitions, he felt deep sorrow. He warned of its dangers, pleaded for restraint, urged nations to find paths of cooperation rather than destruction. His voice was gentle, but it carried across oceans, across government, across time. Visitors came often, scholars, journalists, leaders, and children. Some arrived expecting a figure of cold genius, but they found instead a man who smiled warmly, who welcomed them into modest rooms, who poured tea with unhurried hands. He listened with patience. His wisdom was not only in equations, but in the way he saw life. He spoke of imagination as more important than knowledge, of curiosity as the fuel of the human spirit, of simplicity as the heart of happiness. His quirks became legend. The wild hair, the refusal to wear socks, the habit of carrying sheets of notes folded into a pocket, the distracted air as he walked lost in thought. To the world, these became symbols of genius. To Einstein, they were simply his way of living. He laughed at the attention, sometimes amused, sometimes weary. Fame had never been his goal, and even as it wrapped around him, he kept his feet firmly in the ordinary. At home, he read, he played his violin, he entertained guests with kindness. He loved long walks, sometimes alone, sometimes with companions who listened as he spoke of light, of space, of the beauty of questions. He loved children, answering their letters with care, reminding them to stay curious, to never stop wondering. As the years passed, his body grew frailer and his mind remained sharp. He aged with dignity, his gaze still full of wonder. He spoke often of humility, reminding others that human knowledge was small compared to the vastness of the universe. He believed that to look at the stars was to feel both small and connected, both humbled and inspired. On April 18, 1955, Albert Einstein passed away in Princeton. He was 76 years old. The news spread across the world. People mourned not only the scientist who had changed physics, but the man who had reminded them to seek truth, to value curiosity, to live simply. His ashes were scattered quietly, as he had wished. No monument, no grandeur. His legacy was not in stone, but in thought, in music, in the light of wonder he left behind. Einstein's story did not end with his death. His theories continued to guide science. His words continued to inspire peace. His image, with wild hair and gentle eyes, continued to symbolize the beauty of curiosity. Children still looked at compasses and remembered his wonder. Musicians still played violins and felt his joy. Scientists still asked questions that grew from his stretching into space, into time, into the unknown. He was not only the man who gave the world relativity, he was the man who reminded the world that imagination matters, that patience is strength, that simplicity is wisdom. His life was not only about discoveries, but about the way he lived, modest, curious, humble, and full of wonder. The boy who once lay awake in Munich, staring at the stars through a window, became the man who gave humanity new ways of seeing. The child who marveled at the trembling compass needle became the thinker who mapped the invisible laws of space and time. The students dismissed by teachers became the teacher of a generation. So his legacy endures, not only in physics, but in the rhythm of human curiosity. Albert Einstein remains a symbol of what it means to wonder, to question, to seek. His story is a reminder that greatness is not born in noise, but in silence, in patience, in the refusal to stop asking. This was Hypnos. Another story has been told, and now it's time to rest. Good night. And so Albert Einstein grew from a curious child into a man who changed how humanity sees reality itself. He taught us that time and space are not fixed, that imagination is more powerful than knowledge, and that even in the vast silence of the universe, our questions make us infinite. As you close your eyes now, remember, inside you too burns a spark, the same light that guided Einstein through mystery and wonder. Let your thought wander among the stars, for every dream begins with curiosity, and every bedtime can be the dawn of discovery.